Thank you, Clement. It's always a challenge to follow Yannick. So if we can do the first thing, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I have a lot of extension colleagues in extension that first they tell you what they're going to say, then they say it, and then they tell you what they said. And hopefully it sinks in at least one of those 3 times. I'll just do it, I think, in the interest of time. 4 parts. People sort of have a sense of what the OECD is, but I thought it'd be worth giving you a little bit more of a sense. A little bit more on the OECD Rural Policy Program, then some big themes from the review. I'm not going to go through the review in great detail because it's been done at Quebec City and it'll come out when it's released. But I'd like to kind of tell you more about how I saw the review. And then the last part is pure speculation on my part about what the review and what the year I spent at the OECD, how that might give some ideas that are potentially useful for you guys in developing rural Canada. Okay, so the OECD, it's in Paris. And it's made up of 30 countries, and I'll show you what they are. There's 2 things that you have to do in order to be part of the OECD. You have to have a democratic government, and you have to have a largely market-oriented economic system. So those are the 2 criteria for membership. So that right away gives everybody basically a starting point to buy into, which will make it very difficult for China to become a member of the OECD, for example, even though the OECD desperately would like to have China part of the OECD. It actually evolved out of World War II's Marshall Plan that reconstructed Europe. After Europe was reconstructed, this idea of talking amongst each other to try and coordinate economic policy seemed like such a good idea. They created an organization to continue the process. And what it really is a consulting entity for national governments. It gives policy advice, so it's kind of a McKinsey or C.D. Howe in a Canadian context, but it only deals with national governments. And it's purely advisory in nature. It's not like GATT, where people agree to do something, and then there's the force of a treaty that says that you have to do it. The OECD is a talking club. It's about talking about ideas and trying to find some sense of commonality, common interest, learning from each other. Okay, so next, there's the OECD, the countries in dark blue, and you can see that North America is by far the largest part of the OECD in geographic sense, but the vast bulk of the OECD is in Europe. And in many ways, the OECD, because 20 of the 30 countries are European, has a very, at times, Eurocentric view of what is the right thing to do. And it's, as a sort of a nonpartisan comment, I think Canada is important for the OECD because Canada is vocal in both the official languages, English and French, and forces the OECD to think about things in other than an EU context, which is particularly helpful. Okay, mission statement, you can read that. It's all lovely mission statement words that allow you to do almost anything but sound good. The operation, there's a Secretary General who, the Secretary General before this was a Canadian, and John Johnson, and he reports to a council. The council is made up of an ambassador, who is like a regular ambassador from everybody else who comes from external affairs, and they're accredited, and the council makes the rules. The Secretary General is the administrative agent of the council. Money comes from direct membership fees. When you enter, you agree to give them a certain amount of money every year, and then there's voluntary contributions on top of that. There's 12 theme-oriented directorates. The 2 that we're going to be focusing on are TAG, which is Trade and Agriculture, which is the unnatural Governments and Territorial Development, Gov, which is also another unnatural alliance. Both of those exist for administrative reasons, but look at different things that they do. And the crucial thing about the OECD is because it's voluntary, because its agenda comes from the countries, there are these things called working parties. And some of you may have participated in working parties for the ministries that you're involved in. And the working parties actually set the work program for in specific areas. The working parties are made up of people who work for national governments. They go to Paris once or twice a year, and there'll be one on rural. The Rural Working Party, for example, deals with rural issues and defines over time a two-year program of work that the secretary is then charged with carrying out, reporting to the working party. The working party approves it, and then it becomes official OECD policy. Okay, next. All right, so this is OECD's way of working. This is OECD's description of how OECD works, which is somewhat different from how OECD actually works. They try very hard to be a sort of knowledge-based, data-driven, what are the facts and let the facts shape the policy. So there's data, analysis, discussion, decisions, more discussion, implementation, and the peer review process is an interesting part. In everything that the OECD tries to do, it tries to involve, if it's in the country, it tries to bring in people from another couple of countries who have similar experience, similar issues, so that enhances that learning process, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the reviews. Okay, next. Okay, so the Rural Policy Program, we can go through that one. And as I said, it's two directorates, Gov and TAG. The agriculture people mainly do agriculturally focused work on rural development. Agriculture has historically hated the idea of rural development, the Agriculture Committee. But as the EU moves its agricultural policy away from direct support into Pillar 2, which is rural development, the Agriculture Committee is being sucked deeper and deeper into thinking about rural development. This is one of these cases where the 20 EU members would like agriculture to do more, and it's being resisted strenuously by Canada, Australia, the United States, and all of the non-EU countries who want agriculture to do agriculture and not rural development. How that's going to work out, we'll see. Gov has a directorate or a division that does regional competitiveness and governance, and the Rural Policy Program sits within that. And the focus of the Rural Policy Program for the last few years has been looking at the policy experience of different nations and trying to figure out ways to enhance how that works. Next. Okay, there's a typo there. It should be 1993. And the triggering event was this book called What Future for Our Countryside, which really came out and said, rural is different. Rural is different in important ways, and it was the beginning of the idea that rural can be something other than farming, and it can be something other than backwards. The initial work that Heather was a part of, and Heather and I go back to Paris for a long time, was rural employment, niche markets, amenities, governance. There were a lot of Canadian examples in that initial stuff, largely driven by the work that Heather and Ray did. And then it slowly evolved into doing more subnational, territorial types of analysis, but with a very spatial focus. What's this region look like? What's a rural region? And the big issues in all of this work over time have been, what are the opportunities and constraints for sustainable development in rural areas? How can you make rural areas better? And how does policy influence them? Okay, next.